The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were real. They were just not in Babylon. For as long as the seven wonders have been listed, the Hanging Gardens have sat among them a lush, terraced tower rising above the desert city on the Euphrates, built by Nebuchadnezzar II as a gift for his mountain-born queen. It is one of the most repeated stories from the ancient world. It is also, as a growing body of evidence suggests, almost entirely wrong. The Babylonian archives have survived. Thousands of tablets, detailed records of construction, trade, ritual, and daily life under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Scholars have read them carefully, and the gardens, the most spectacular building project the king supposedly ever undertook, are not mentioned anywhere in any of them. What fills that silence is stranger and more compelling than the legend. An Oxford Assyriologist, working patiently with cuneiform for decades, followed the evidence to a different empire, a different ruler, and a city hundreds of miles from Babylon. But before we get to what she found, we need to understand exactly how deep that silence runs and what should have been there. Nebuchadnezzar was not a modest king. He was not a king who built quietly and let others take credit. He was a king who documented himself relentlessly. We have thousands of his inscriptions, foundation cylinders buried under buildings, describing what he built and why, wall inscriptions listing his projects, prayers to the gods thanking them for allowing him to raise this temple or restore that shrine or expand this palace or reinforce those walls. If you want to know what Nebuchadnezzar did in Babylon, you do not have to guess. He tells you, in detail, at length, repeatedly, and in all of that documentation, across thousands of lines of cuneiform, describing every significant building project he undertook, describing walls and gates and temples and canals and processional ways and palaces, there is not a single reference to a garden. Not one. He never mentions it. He never claims credit for it. He never thanks a god for helping him build it. He never describes it to anyone. This should feel strange. Take a moment and let it feel as strange as it actually is. A king who obsessively documented every stone he laid, who left inscriptions under the floors of buildings he restored, somehow forgot to mention the single most spectacular structure ever attributed to his reign. A structure that later became one of the seven wonders of the world. He never wrote it down. Now, you could argue that maybe the tablets are lost. Maybe there was an inscription, and it simply has not survived. And that argument would be reasonable in isolation. Babylonian tablets do get lost. Fires happen. Time happens. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Except the German archaeologists went looking for the physical structure itself. At the beginning of the 20th century, a team led by Robert Koldewey excavated Babylon systematically over almost 2 decades. They mapped the walls. They found the Ishtar Gate. They identified the processional way. They dug through the royal palaces. They knew where everything was, because Nebuchadnezzar had told them where everything was in his own inscriptions thousands of years earlier. And they looked very carefully for anything that could be the Hanging Gardens. They did not find them. There is a location near the southern palace that Koldewey tentatively identified as a possible candidate, but the identification was always uncertain, and later work has more or less dismantled it. The structure Koldewey found does not match the classical descriptions. The scale is wrong. The location relative to the river is wrong. And most importantly, no irrigation system compatible with lifting water to any significant height was ever recovered at Babylon. No screws, no cascading channels, no engineering infrastructure that could deliver the amount of water the classical sources describe. So we have a king who never mentioned the garden, a city where the garden cannot be found, and an irrigation system that leaves no trace anywhere in the archaeological record. And yet the entire world, for 2,000 years, has been absolutely certain that the Hanging Gardens were in Babylon and were built by Nebuchadnezzar. Where did that certainty come from? It came from the Greeks. And this is where the story starts to get interesting, because the Greeks who wrote about the Hanging Gardens were not eyewitnesses. They were writing centuries later, working from earlier sources that themselves were working from earlier sources, in a long chain of transmission that had passed through the collapse of the Babylonian Empire, the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, and the conquests of Alexander. Diodorus Siculus wrote about the gardens in the 1st century before the Common Era, roughly 500 years after Nebuchadnezzar. Strabo wrote about them around the same period. Neither man had ever set foot in Babylon during its glory. By the time Greek writers were describing the wonder, Babylon was already ruined, already emptied, already becoming the ghost city it would be for the next 2,000 years. And when the Greeks arrived at that ruined city, they did what humans always do when confronted with impressive ruins and a strong cultural narrative. They matched the story to the place in front of them. There was a legend floating through the ancient world of a great city with impossible gardens. There was a great ruined city right in front of them, called Babylon. Therefore, the gardens must have been here. Therefore, they must have been built by the most famous king who ruled here. Therefore, the story is settled. Except the story was not settled. It was assembled 5 centuries after the fact by people who had inherited a legend and pinned it to the wrong map. This is the point at which Stephanie Dalley enters the story. Dalley is an Assyriologist. She spent her career reading cuneiform tablets, working with the actual primary sources from the ancient Near East, in the languages the ancient Near East actually used. And over the course of decades of work, she began to notice something. The classical descriptions of the Hanging Gardens, the terraces, the watering system, the layout, the botanical variety, did not match anything anyone had ever found in Babylon. But they did match something else. They matched, with almost eerie precision, a description that survived from a different king in a different city a full century earlier. The king was Sennacherib. The city was Nineveh. The empire was Assyrian, not Babylonian. And unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib did document his garden, in detail, at length, in multiple inscriptions. Sennacherib ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the late 8th century into the early 7th century before the Common Era. He built a new palace at Nineveh, on the Tigris River, in what is today northern Iraq. And around that palace, he built a garden. He described it in his own inscriptions as a wonder for all peoples. He described the plants he brought in from across his empire. He described the terraces on which they grew. And, critically, he described the engineering. Sennacherib built an aqueduct system that carried water from the mountains to Nineveh across dozens of kilometers using stone-lined channels that survive in the landscape today. And to lift the water the final distance up onto the terraces of his garden, he describes casting bronze screws, a mechanism that would not be attributed to Archimedes for another 400 years, but which Sennacherib appears to have engineered a full century before Archimedes was born. Reliefs from Sennacherib's own palace, carved into the walls of the throne room, show a garden, terraced, elevated, with trees growing at multiple levels, supported by columned arcades, with water channels running through the structure. The image on the wall matches, almost stroke for stroke, the classical description of the Hanging Gardens. So we have a king who documented his garden in a city where the aqueduct still stands, with a wall carving that shows exactly what the classical sources describe, using an engineering method the classical sources also describe. And this king is not Nebuchadnezzar. This city is not Babylon. This is a century earlier and several hundred kilometers to the north. At this point, you might reasonably ask a question, and this is the same question Dalley had to answer because it is the obvious objection that any serious scholar would raise. If the gardens were at Nineveh, and the Greeks said they were at Babylon, why should we believe the Greeks got it wrong? These were literate people, working from earlier sources. Surely they did not simply confuse two cities hundreds of kilometers apart. Daly engaged that objection directly, because she knew the entire argument stood or fell on it, and her answer involves understanding what the ancient Near East actually looked like in the centuries between Sennacherib and the Greeks. Nineveh was destroyed in the year 612 before the Common Era, sacked by a coalition that included the Babylonians themselves. The city was burned, abandoned, and largely forgotten as a living place. Meanwhile, the Babylonians, who had helped destroy it, absorbed its territory, its people, and this is critical, its stories. In some Assyrian inscriptions of the period, the term Babylon was used loosely to refer to the broader region of Mesopotamia, not just the specific city. And after the Assyrian Empire fell, the surviving cultural memory of the great city with impossible gardens attached itself to the most visible surviving Mesopotamian capital, which was Babylon. By the time Greek travelers arrived, centuries later, they were walking into a landscape where Nineveh was a ruin nobody talked about, and Babylon was the only remaining reference point. They heard the story. They saw the ruins in front of them. They matched them together, and they were wrong. This is why the traditional attribution has survived for so long, not because it was ever verified, but because it was never seriously questioned. The Greeks wrote it down. Everyone else copied the Greeks. And for 2,000 years, the label stuck to the wrong location. Now, before we go further, it is worth pausing on something about the people who actually built this garden, because there is a temptation, when we talk about ancient engineering, to treat the builders as somehow less than us, simpler minds, cruder tools, working by instinct rather than by understanding. And this temptation is almost always wrong, but it is particularly wrong here. The people who designed the water system at Nineveh were solving the exact same problem a modern hydraulic engineer would solve today. They needed to move a large volume of water from a higher elevation to a specific delivery point, across difficult terrain, at a consistent flow rate, and then lift the final vertical distance against gravity. They did not have electric pumps. They did not have modern surveying equipment. They did not have steel. And yet they built stone-lined aqueducts that maintained precise gradients over dozens of kilometers, and they cast bronze screws capable of raising water to the required height. That is not primitive engineering. That is engineering. The tools were different. The physics was identical. The intelligence that built the garden at Nineveh was the same intelligence that would design a dam today or route a pipeline through a mountain range. It was solving the same problem with the resources it had, at the scale the resources allowed. The gap between them and us is not a gap of mind. It is a gap of accumulated tools. Which brings us to the last part of this story, and to the part that makes it genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply revisionist. The Assyrian Empire, the empire that built the garden, the empire whose king cast bronze screws to lift water to terraces of imported trees, this same empire is one of the most systematically brutal state structures in the ancient world for which we have direct evidence. And when I say direct evidence, I mean the Assyrians themselves. The palace reliefs at Nineveh, the same reliefs that show us the terraced garden, also show us other scenes. Deportations of entire populations, walking in columns out of conquered cities, prisoners being flayed alive, described in the accompanying inscriptions in language the kings themselves chose to preserve, impalements, mass executions arranged as public displays, cities burned. Populations relocated across hundreds of kilometers to break their sense of homeland. These were not accusations invented by enemies. These were the state's own records. carved into the walls of its own throne room, meant to be seen by ambassadors and subjects and future kings. The terror was policy. It was documented as policy. It was celebrated as policy. And on other walls, in the same building, the same king who ordered those deportations describes his garden, the trees he collected, the water he raised. The wonder for all peoples that he built for his own pleasure and for the awe of visitors. Both things sit on the walls of the same palace, the garden and the flayings, the screw pump and the deportation columns, the engineering that impressed the ancient world and the terror that held the empire together. Neither one cancels the other. Neither one explains the other. They coexist on stone, carved by the same hand, ordered by the same king, meant to be read as parts of the same story about the same reign. That is the honest ending of the story. Not that we found the real builder and the real location and now everything is neat, but that when we found them, we also found the fuller picture of what kind of civilization built the wonder, a civilization capable of hydraulic mathematics that would not be duplicated in Europe for another 400 years, and a civilization capable of state cruelty that its own artists carved into permanent stone without embarrassment. Both records survive. Both are equally the work of the same people. So the next time you see an artist's reconstruction of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, with the terraces rising against a golden sky and the vines cascading down over the arches, remember what you are actually looking at. You are probably looking at the wrong city. You are almost certainly looking at the wrong king. You are looking at an engineering achievement that predates its supposed date by a century and its supposed location by hundreds of kilometers. And you are looking at the product of an empire whose own throne room walls show side by side the beauty it built and the violence it required. The Greeks got the name wrong. The medieval world inherited the mistake. The modern world put it into every school book. And it took an Assyriologist reading cuneiform in Oxford, matching a king's own words to a wall's own images to an aqueduct still standing in the landscape, to begin to correct a 2,000-year-old error. The Hanging Gardens were probably real. They were probably spectacular. They were probably not in Babylon. They were probably not built for a homesick queen. They were probably built by Sennacherib of Assyria in Nineveh, watered by bronze screws he cast himself, on the same grounds where his artists carved the deportations that fed his empire. That is the actual wonder, not the postcard version. The real one, with all its contradictions still attached, exactly as the stone recorded them. Don't miss the next video either. It's just as fascinating, and it's waiting for you right now.